In the structures video introduction, we covered properties as the main element of structs. But the reality is there's another key part of structs called methods. So let's jump in and take a look at how they are created and used. In this presentation, we're going to look at methods associated with structs. We're going to cover two aspects of them. One is what are these methods and how would we use them? So let's consider the following rectangle. In this rectangle, we have a bunch of different attributes associated with it. So for example, we have a width here of the rectangle. We have a height here. And we have an area that can be calculated based on the width and the height. And we also have a hypotenuse, which can also be calculated based on the width and the height. So when we look at this, how would we represent a new type rectangle in Swift? And how would we calculate the area and the hypotenuse of this rectangle? So here is one option. In this option, we have the rectangle. And notice we have var x and y. We're going to assume that those are our origin in the top left corner of wherever the rectangle is going to be. And then we have a width and a height. And this is our struct. So we basically have these four elements, and they're basically four doubles. Then we declare a function outside of this struct, basically just a free-floating function here called area. And area is basically takes in a width and it takes in a height, and then it returns a double. And the calculation to do that is quite easy. It's right here. It's just returning width times height. Now, the second one is hypotenuse. So the formula is the square root of width squared plus height squared will give you the hypotenuse. And we can write this and convert this into Swift in the following way. There's two functions that you can use to do this. One is the POW function, which means power. So we have power with an open paren, closed paren, two arguments, which is basically taking the first value is going to be raised to the power of the second value. So here is power width to the power 2, which is width squared, pow of height, so that's height squared. And then this whole thing, which we have in parentheses, is actually a double. And it turns out a double has a method on it that you can call. And this is what we're going to be introduced to even in our own struct, where we have dot square root, open close paren. That's how we know this is a method, basically a function that's associated with doubles, where we can get the square root of that particular value. So this will actually calculate the hypotenuse. This is equivalent to this. Another way you could do it is if you didn't want to use the power function, you could just say width times width plus height times height, and that works as well. So this is how we create the hypotenuse. So we can then create a function here as well that says hypotenuse. We give it a width and a height, and we have a double as a return. And then there is our formula that we just went through. So we now have these two functions, and they operate on elements of this rectangle. So this function area and function hypotenuse are really operating on two components of a rectangle. And so you would sort of think that those functions really should be associated more tightly with the rectangle type or the rectangle struct than just sitting out there on their own. So for example, if we remove this still was working fine, but they kind of really go with the rectangle itself. So how do we do that, and how do we represent that better? So let's start out with the struct itself. So here we have the struct that we had before with the open and closing brackets. And then what we're going to do is bring those two functions inside the struct itself. So where they were outside before, now they're inside this rectangle struct. That's step number one. Then the second step is to realize that actually when we were passing in width and height here and width and height here, that width and height are already properties of rectangle. since they're already a property of rectangle, these functions right here will see these properties or variables without a problem. They will reference them directly. What that means is that we can actually get rid of passing these arguments. So if we take those out, this is still valid. So we have the area, and although it's still a function, but it doesn't have any parameters, so we still do the open and close paren. It still returns a double, and then we have our return statement here and our return statement here. By the way, return many times is optional. You don't need to put the term in if it's implied that this is what it's doing, is returning a value. So I just thought I'd show one case where we use return, one case where we don't. I prefer that you use return, although in Swift UI, you'll see a lot of cases where there's no return and we just use it straight away. But the point here is that we have two functions now that are part of the struct. And because of that, they are now referred to as methods. They are functions. They're associated with the struct. We just refer to them as methods. It's just a naming reference change. And so area is a method on rectangle. Hypotenuse is a method on rectangle. So how do we use those? Well, here we've declared a var called myRect. And here was our initializer. So we have the rectangle. We gave it some initial 0, 0 point. And then we gave it a width of 3 and a height of 4. And so the area here is going to be myRect.area. So just like we would say dot width or dot height, we would say dot and the function name or the method name. And we use the open and close parens because we're not passing any parameters. And here we get the hypotenuse by doing the dot notation as well for that particular method. And that's how we can read those values. When we do this, this calculation will be called. When we do this, this calculation will be called and the value returned. So that is methods. Basically, we talked about what a method is and how do we use them. That's how we do it.